The version of yourself that you're protecting is actually your enemy. And every day you defend it, you're choosing mediocrity over magnificence. You've spent years building an identity around your limitations, your circumstances, and your excuses. And now you're more committed to being consistent with that false self than you are to becoming who you were actually meant to be. You fight harder to defend your right to stay stuck than you will to claim your right to be free. The person you think you're being loyal to by refusing to change isn't even real. It's just a collection of other people's expectations and your own fears wearing a mask with your name on it. You know what's interesting about mirrors? They never lie. They can't. They don't have the capacity for deception, for making you feel better about yourself, for telling you what you want to hear. A mirror simply reflects what is. And that's exactly why most people avoid looking into them too closely. But let me tell you about James. James was a man who had mastered the art of looking without seeing. For 15 years, he built what everyone called a successful life. Corner office on the 40th floor, expensive suits, a house in the suburbs that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Every morning, he'd stand in his marble bathroom, straightening his tie, checking his appearance, making sure everything looked perfect for another day of what he called living. But one Tuesday morning, something happened that changed everything. As James stood there doing his usual routine, something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the light hit his face, or maybe it was just time for truth to have its moment. But for the first time in years, James really looked at himself. Not at his suit, not at his hair, not at the image he was projecting to the world. He looked at his eyes. What he saw terrified him. The eyes looking back weren't the eyes of a man who was living. They were the eyes of someone who was merely existing, going through the motions, playing a role that someone else had written for his life. In that moment, James realized he had become a stranger to himself. He was looking at a man who had spent so much time becoming what others expected him to be that he had forgotten who he actually was. That mirror didn't just show James his reflection that morning, it showed him his prison. And the most shocking part, he was both the prisoner and the warden. He had locked himself away so completely that he didn't even remember what freedom felt like. See, here's what most people don't understand about transformation. It doesn't begin with motivation. It doesn't begin with inspiration. It doesn't begin with someone telling you that you can do it. Real transformation begins with one moment of brutal honesty. It begins when you stop running from the truth about where you really are in your life. James had spent 15 years perfecting the art of self-deception. He'd convinced himself that being busy meant being productive. He'd convinced himself that having things meant having a life. He'd convinced himself that looking successful meant being successful. But that mirror stripped away all the lies he'd been telling himself, and for the first time in years, he was face to face with reality. The reality was that James had been living someone else's dream. His parents' dream of what success should look like. His wife's dream of what security should feel like. His colleagues' dream of what achievement should measure like. But nowhere in his perfectly organized, impressively structured life was there any evidence of James's own dreams, James's own passions, James's own purpose. That's when James discovered something that changed his life forever. He discovered that you cannot fix what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot heal what you will not face. You cannot change what you continue to deny. That mirror forced him to acknowledge that his life, despite all its external success, was internally empty. This is where most people get stuck. They know something isn't right, but they're afraid to look closely enough to see what it is. They'd rather live with the discomfort of a life that doesn't fit than face the temporary pain of honest self-examination. They'd rather pretend everything is fine than admit they've been living a lie. But James made a decision that morning that most people never make. He decided to stop lying to himself. He decided that the pain of truth was better than the comfort of deception. He decided that 3 days of facing reality was better than 30 years of avoiding it. You see, the mirror doesn't just show you what's wrong, it shows you what's possible. When James looked at himself that morning, yes, he saw emptiness, but he also saw potential. He saw a man who had the intelligence to build a successful career, which meant he had the intelligence to build a meaningful life. He saw a man who had the discipline to maintain an image, which meant he had the discipline to pursue authenticity. He saw a man who had the strength to carry everyone else's expectations, which meant he had the strength to carry his own dreams. The problem wasn't that James lacked ability. The problem was that James had been using his ability to build someone else's life instead of his own. He had been so focused on meeting external standards that he had never stopped to ask himself what his internal standards were. He had been so busy climbing the ladder of success that he never stopped to check if the ladder was leaning against the right wall. That morning in front of the mirror was James's moment of awakening. Not the comfortable awakening that comes from reading inspiring quotes or listening to motivational speeches, but the uncomfortable awakening that comes from confronting the gap between who you are and who you were meant to be. This is what I want you to understand. Every person who has ever transformed their life has had a mirror moment. A moment when they stopped making excuses and started facing facts. A moment when they stopped blaming circumstances and started taking responsibility.
A moment when they stopped waiting for conditions to be perfect and started working with conditions as they are. Your mirror moment might not happen in an actual mirror. It might happen when you realize you've been working at a job that's slowly killing your soul. It might happen when you realize you've been in relationships that drain your energy instead of feeding your spirit. It might happen when you realize you've been living so far below your potential that you've forgotten what your potential even looks like. But whenever your mirror moment comes, you'll have the same choice James had. You can turn away from the truth and go back to the comfortable lie. Or you can embrace the truth and begin the most important journey of your life, the journey from who you've become to who you were meant to be. James chose truth, and that choice, made in 3 seconds in front of a bathroom mirror, led to a transformation that took 3 days to implement and 3 months to see the full results. But it started with one moment of absolute honesty about where he really was.
After James had his mirror moment, he thought the hard part was over. He thought that seeing the truth would automatically lead to change. But what James discovered next is what separates those who dream about transformation from those who actually experience it. He discovered that awareness without action is just sophisticated procrastination. Day one of fixing yourself isn't about adding new things to your life. It's about removing the things that are killing you. And let me be clear about something. There are things in your life right now that are slowly poisoning your potential, stealing your energy, and blocking your path to who you're meant to become. Day one is about having the courage to identify these things and the strength to eliminate them. You cannot build a mansion on a cracked foundation. You cannot plant a garden in soil that's contaminated with toxins. And you cannot create a new life while holding on to the old patterns, relationships, and mindsets that created the life you're trying to escape from. James realized this on his first day. As he sat in his office that Wednesday morning, he made a list. Not a list of goals or dreams or aspirations. A list of everything in his life that was contributing to the emptiness he saw in the mirror. The list was longer than he expected and more painful than he wanted to admit. At the top of the list was his best friend, Robert. Robert was the kind of person who had an opinion about everything and a solution for nothing. Every conversation with Robert left James feeling drained, discouraged, and diminished. Robert had a gift for finding the problem in every opportunity and the impossibility in every dream. He disguised his negativity as realism and his pessimism as wisdom. For years, James had tolerated Robert's toxic influence because they had history together. They'd been friends since college. They'd been through struggles together. They had shared memories and mutual connections. But James realized that day that loyalty to the past was preventing him from stepping into his future. He realized that some relationships are like quicksand. The longer you stay in them, the deeper they pull you down. But James's story isn't unique. Let me tell you about Lisa. Lisa was a teacher who had always dreamed of opening her own school. She had the vision, the passion, and even some of the funding. But there was one problem. Her assistant principal, Jennifer, was also her closest friend, and Jennifer was terrified of change. Every time Lisa brought up her dream of starting her own school, Jennifer would flood her with reasons why it wouldn't work. The market was too competitive. The regulations were too complicated. The risks were too high. Jennifer wasn't trying to be malicious. She was trying to protect Lisa from disappointment. But what she was actually doing was protecting Lisa from her destiny. For 3 years, Lisa allowed Jennifer's fear to become her own limitation. She allowed someone else's comfort zone to become her prison. She was so afraid of hurting Jennifer's feelings that she was willing to bury her own dreams. But then Lisa had her mirror moment. She realized that she was 42 years old and had spent the last 3 years talking about the same dream without taking a single step toward it. She realized that she was allowing friendship to become a barrier to fulfillment. She realized that sometimes the people who love you the most can accidentally limit you the most. The decision Lisa made next was one of the hardest decisions of her life. She decided to distance herself from Jennifer, not because she stopped caring about Jennifer, but because she started caring about her own future. She realized that if she continued to allow Jennifer's fears to influence her decisions, she would wake up at 65 having lived Jennifer's life instead of her own. This is what day one is about. It's about recognizing that your environment is stronger than your willpower. It's about understanding that you cannot rise to a level that your associations won't allow. It's about accepting that some relationships, no matter how comfortable or familiar they are actually preventing you from becoming who you're meant to be. But it's not just about relationships. Day one is also about eliminating toxic habits, toxic thoughts, and toxic patterns that have become so normal you don't even notice them anymore. James realized that he spent 2 hours every evening watching television shows that added absolutely nothing to his life. 2 hours that he could have been learning something new, building something meaningful, or connecting with people who inspired him. But instead, he was numbing his mind with entertainment that was neither entertaining nor enriching. He realized that he had developed a habit of complaining. Not obvious complaining, but subtle complaining. Complaining about traffic, complaining about weather, complaining about politics, complaining about people. And every complaint was like a small withdrawal from his mental and emotional energy account. By the end of each day, he was emotionally bankrupt. Not because anything terrible had happened, but because he had leaked his energy through 1,000 small complaints. He realized that he had been feeding his mind the same way most people feed their bodies, with junk. Junk information, junk entertainment, junk conversations. And just like junk food makes your body weak, junk input makes your mind weak.
Day one of transformation requires what I call strategic elimination. You must become ruthless about what you allow into your life and what you allow to stay in your life. You must develop the ability to say no to good things so you can say yes to great things. You must learn to distinguish between what feels comfortable and what actually serves your growth. This is where most people fail. They try to add positive things to their life without removing the negative things. It's like trying to fill a bucket that has holes in the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it keeps leaking out. You must fix the holes before you can fill the bucket. Lisa learned this lesson the hard way. After she distanced herself from Jennifer, she felt guilty for weeks. She questioned her decision. She wondered if she was being selfish or cruel. But then something interesting happened. Without Jennifer's constant negativity filling her mental space, Lisa began to see possibilities she had never noticed before. Ideas began to flow. Opportunities began to appear. Energy began to return. Within 6 months of making that difficult decision, Lisa had opened her school. Not because she suddenly became more talented or more capable, but because she removed the obstacle that was preventing her talent and capability from expressing themselves. Day one isn't about becoming someone new. It's about removing everything that's preventing you from becoming who you already are. Underneath all the accumulated toxicity of years of poor choices, toxic relationships, and limiting beliefs, the truth is this: you are not broken, you are not defective, you are not lacking in potential, you are simply buried under years of accumulated debris. Day one is about excavation. It's about digging through the layers of other people's expectations, society's definitions of success, and your own fears and doubts to rediscover the authentic self that's been waiting underneath all along. James spent his first day making phone calls he didn't want to make and having conversations he had been avoiding for years. He canceled subscriptions to magazines he never read. He deleted phone numbers of people who only called him when they needed something. He threw away items that represented the old version of himself that he was leaving behind. By the end of day one, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt lighter, not because he had added anything to his life, but because he had removed the weight that was holding him down. He had created space for something new to grow.
By the time James woke up on day two, something had shifted. The heaviness he'd carried for years was gone. His mind felt clearer, like someone had cleaned the windows of his consciousness. But James quickly realized that having clean windows isn't enough. You need something beautiful to look at through them. Day two is about filling the space you created on day one with the right things. Think about this carefully. When a farmer clears a field of weeds, he doesn't just leave it empty. Empty ground has a funny way of growing more weeds. The farmer immediately plants seeds of what he actually wants to grow. Day two of your transformation is planting day. But here's what most people get wrong. They try to plant the same seeds that everyone else is planting, expecting to get different results. James learned this lesson from the most unexpected source. Let me tell you about Michael. Michael wasn't someone James knew personally, but Michael's story became the blueprint for James's day two transformation. Michael had spent 8 years of his life addicted to substances that nearly destroyed everything he touched. His family had given up on him. His friends had written him off. His employers wouldn't hire him. At 32 years old, Michael was living in a halfway house with nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation that followed him everywhere like a shadow. But Michael understood something about transformation that most people never learn. He understood that changing your life isn't just about changing your habits. It's about changing your environment, your associations, and your entire ecosystem. Michael realized that he couldn't just stop doing the wrong things. He had to start doing the right things in the right places with the right people. On his day two, Michael didn't just commit to staying clean. He moved to a different city. Not because he was running from his problems, but because he was running toward his solution. He understood that environmental change creates behavioral change faster than willpower ever could. In his new city, Michael did something brilliant. He didn't try to make friends with people who were just like him. He sought out people who were like the person he wanted to become. He started volunteering at a youth center, not because he felt obligated to give back, but because he wanted to surround himself with people who believed in transformation. He got a job at a construction company, not because construction was his passion, but because he needed to be around people who built things instead of tearing them down. Every day, he was surrounded by people who took raw materials and created something valuable. That environment began to shape his mindset in ways he never expected. Michael understood that you become like the people you spend the most time with. If you spend time with complainers, you become a complainer. If you spend time with dreamers, you become a dreamer. If you spend time with builders, you become a builder. He chose to spend his time with builders. This is exactly what James needed to understand on his day two. After clearing out the toxic influences from his life, he needed to intentionally fill that space with influences that would pull him toward his highest potential. James started by changing his morning routine. Instead of checking emails and news first thing in the morning, which filled his mind with other people's problems and the world's negativity, he started reading biographies of people who had built the kind of life he wanted to create. Instead of filling his mind with information about what was wrong with the world, he started filling it with examples of what was possible in his world. He changed his commute.
Instead of listening to talk radio hosts complaining about politics, he started listening to podcasts by people who were actually building businesses, creating solutions, and making a difference. His 40-minute drive to work became 40 minutes of education instead of 40 minutes of frustration. But the most important change James made was in his evening routine. Remember those 2 hours he used to spend watching mindless television? He replaced that with something that changed his life. He started attending networking events for entrepreneurs. Now, James wasn't an entrepreneur yet. He was still working his corporate job, but he understood that if he wanted to become something different, he needed to start thinking like that something different. He needed to surround himself with people who thought differently, acted differently, and expected different results from life.
At his first networking event, James met Patricia. Patricia was a woman who had started her consulting business 3 years earlier after leaving a corporate career very similar to James's. She wasn't the most successful person in the room, but she had something James hadn't seen in years. She had excitement about her work. She talked about her clients with genuine enthusiasm. She spoke about challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles. Patricia became James's first new association. Not a best friend, not a mentor, just someone whose mindset and energy were aligned with the direction James wanted to go. Patricia didn't know she was influencing James. She was just being herself. But her way of being was exactly what James needed to see. This is how day 2 works. You don't just remove negative influences. You actively seek out positive influences. You don't just stop doing things that drain you. You start doing things that energize you. You don't just cut off relationships that limit you. You cultivate relationships that expand you. Michael learned this same principle at the youth center. He started mentoring teenagers who were making some of the same mistakes he had made. But something unexpected happened. In teaching them how to make better choices, he was reinforcing his own commitment to better choices. In encouraging them to pursue their dreams, he was awakening dreams in himself that he thought had died years ago. One of the teenagers Michael mentored was a 17-year-old named Anthony. Anthony had incredible artistic talent, but lived in an environment where art was considered a waste of time. Michael helped Anthony see that talent without opportunity is just potential, but talent with the right support can become extraordinary achievement. Michael started researching art schools for Anthony. He started connecting Anthony with local artists who could provide guidance. He started helping Anthony build a portfolio. But in the process of helping Anthony pursue his artistic dreams, Michael discovered something about himself. He discovered that he had a gift for seeing potential in people and helping them develop that potential. That discovery led Michael to a realization that changed everything. His addiction hadn't just taken 8 years from his life. It had hidden his true purpose from him. His purpose wasn't just to get clean and stay clean. His purpose was to help other people clean up their lives and discover their own potential. Within 2 years of his transformation, Michael had started his own nonprofit organization focused on helping people in recovery discover and develop their talents. He understood that recovery isn't just about stopping destructive behavior. It's about starting purposeful behavior. It's about replacing what was killing you with what was meant to fulfill you. This is the power of day 2. When you fill the space you created on day 1 with the right influences, associations, and activities, you don't just change your behavior. You discover capabilities you didn't know you had. You uncover passions you thought were buried forever. You reconnect with dreams you assumed were impossible. James experienced this same awakening. As he continued attending networking events, something began to shift in how he saw himself. He started seeing opportunities everywhere he looked. He started having ideas for solutions to problems he encountered. He started believing that maybe, just maybe, he had what it took to build something meaningful. Day 2 isn't about forcing change. It's about creating conditions where change becomes natural. When you surround yourself with people who are growing, growth becomes normal. When you fill your mind with examples of possibility, possibility becomes expected. When you spend your time in environments that celebrate achievement, achievement becomes your standard. By the end of day 2, both James and Michael had experienced something profound. They hadn't just changed their circumstances, they had changed their identity. They were no longer people who were trying to change. They were people who were changing. The shift from trying to being is what makes day 2 so powerful. The seeds they planted on day 2 weren't just new habits or new relationships. They were new ways of seeing themselves and new ways of engaging with the world. And seeds planted in the right soil with the right conditions have an amazing capacity for rapid growth. Day 3 is when everything you've done in the previous 2 days begins to crystallize into something extraordinary. It's the day when you stop becoming and start being. It's the day when transformation shifts from a process to identity. James woke up on his 3rd day feeling something he couldn't quite name at first. It wasn't excitement, though excitement was part of it. It wasn't confidence, though confidence was growing. It was recognition. For the first time in 15 years, James recognized himself. The butterfly doesn't remember being a caterpillar. It doesn't wake up thinking about crawling. It doesn't long for the old days of inching along branches. Once the transformation is complete, the butterfly's entire identity is about flying. Day 3 is when you stop remembering who you used to be and start embodying who you actually are. But here's what James discovered that morning. Transformation brings responsibility. When you change your life, you automatically become responsible for showing other people that change is possible. Whether you want to or not, whether you plan to or not, you become a living example that limitations are optional. This is exactly what happened to Michael. Remember Michael from yesterday's part of our story. By his day 3, something remarkable had occurred. The same people who had written him off, who had given up on him, who had assumed he would never amount to anything, began to see him differently. But more importantly, they began to see themselves differently. Michael's transformation had a ripple effect that he never anticipated. His younger brother Tony, who had been following the same destructive path, started asking Michael questions. Not questions about how to stop doing wrong things, but questions about how to start doing right things. Tony had watched Michael for years, going in the wrong direction, and it had confirmed Tony's belief that their family was just cursed to fail. But seeing Michael transform didn't just change Tony's opinion of Michael, it changed Tony's opinion of what was possible for himself. Within 6 months of Michael's transformation, Tony had enrolled in community college. Within a year, Tony had started his own small landscaping business. Within 2 years, Tony was hiring other young men from their neighborhood, creating opportunities for people who had never seen a legitimate path to success. But the story doesn't stop there. Michael's mother, Carmen, had spent years making excuses for her son's failures. She had convinced herself that their environment was too toxic, their opportunities were too limited, their background was too damaged for them to ever really succeed. But watching Michael transform and then watching Tony transform forced Carmen to confront an uncomfortable truth. The problem wasn't their environment. The problem was that she had accepted defeat as normal. Carmen was 58 years old and had been working the same dead-end job for 23 years. She had long ago stopped dreaming about anything better. But seeing her sons change their lives gave her permission to change hers. Carmen went back to school to become a nurse. At 61 years old, she graduated with honors and started working at a local hospital, making more money than she had ever imagined possible and doing work that actually mattered to her. This is the power of day 3. Your transformation becomes a catalyst for other people's transformation. You become living proof that change is possible, that circumstances don't have to be permanent, that the past doesn't have to predict the future. James experienced this same phenomenon. As word spread through his office about the changes in James's attitude, energy, and approach to work, something interesting began to happen. People started coming to him for advice, not because he was telling them they should change their lives, but because his changed life was inspiring them to consider changing theirs. His colleague Sandra had been talking about starting her own marketing consultancy for 3 years, but she had been paralyzed by fear of failure, fear of financial insecurity, fear of what other people would think. Watching James make bold moves in his own life gave Sandra courage to make bold moves in hers. Within 4 months, Sandra had left the company and started her own successful consultancy. His neighbor Frank had been complaining about his marriage for 5 years. But instead of doing the hard work of improving the relationship or making the difficult decision to leave, Frank had just accepted unhappiness as his normal state. Seeing James take control of his life inspired Frank to take control of his Frank. Frank and his wife entered marriage counseling, rebuilt their relationship, and rediscovered why they had fallen in love in the first place. Day 3 is when you realize that your life has never been just about you. Your choices affect your family. Your energy affects your workplace. Your attitude affects your community. Your transformation creates permission for other people to transform. But here's what's crucial to understand. This influence happens naturally, not through preaching or pushing. People don't change because you tell them they should change. People change because you show them that change is possible. Your transformed life becomes a beacon that helps other people find their way out of their own darkness. Michael discovered this when he decided to expand his nonprofit organization. He had started with the simple goal of helping people in recovery discover their talents. But as his organization grew, Michael realized he wasn't just helping individuals. He was helping families, communities, entire neighborhoods see possibility where they had only seen problems. One of the most powerful moments in Michael's journey came when he received a letter from Anthony, the 17-year-old artist he had mentored 3 years earlier. Anthony was now attending art school on a full scholarship and had just sold his first painting to a local gallery. But the letter wasn't just a thank you note, it was a report. Anthony wrote that he had started an art program for younger kids in his neighborhood. He was teaching them the same principles Michael had taught him, that talent without opportunity is just potential, but talent with support can become extraordinary achievement. Anthony had become the Michael of his generation, creating opportunities for kids who had never imagined that their creativity could become their career. The letter ended with a sentence that brought tears to Michael's eyes. "I'm not just an artist now. I'm proof that transformation is possible. And every kid I teach becomes proof too." This is the multiplication effect of authentic transformation. When you change your life the right way, you don't just create success for yourself. You create a template that other people can follow. You become a bridge that helps other people cross from where they are to where they want to be. James experienced this multiplication effect in ways he never expected. After 18 months of living his transformed life, James had not only left his corporate job to start his own business, but he had also become a mentor to other professionals who wanted to make similar transitions. He found himself speaking at conferences, leading workshops, and coaching individuals who were going through their own 3-day transformations. But the most meaningful impact came from an unexpected source. James received a phone call from his 17-year-old nephew, Kevin. Kevin told James that watching his uncle transform had given him courage to pursue his dream of becoming a filmmaker instead of taking the safe path his parents were pushing him toward. Kevin said something that James will never forget. "Uncle James, you didn't just change your life, you changed what I thought was possible for my life. This is why day 3 is so crucial. Day 1 and day 2 are about you. Day 3 is about everyone whose life you touch. Day 3 is when you realize that your transformation isn't selfish, it's service. Every person who changes their life gives permission to someone else to change theirs." By the end of day 3, James understood something profound. His mirror moment hadn't just been about seeing who he was, it had been about accepting responsibility for who he could become. And that responsibility extended far beyond himself. The man who looked back at James from the mirror on day 3 was completely different from the man who had looked back at him 3 days earlier. This wasn't the same person with a better attitude. This was a fundamentally different human being with a different identity, different standards, different expectations, and different impact on the world around him. Day 3 is when you stop trying to become the person you want to be and start being the person you were always meant to be. It's when transformation stops being something you're doing and becomes something you are. And that's when real life begins. 3 years after his mirror moment, James found himself standing in front of a different mirror. This one was in the bathroom of his new office, the headquarters of the consulting firm he had built from nothing but a dream and the courage to act on it. But this time, when he looked at his reflection, something extraordinary happened. He smiled. Not the forced smile of someone pretending to be happy, but the genuine smile of someone who had found their way home to themselves. The eyes looking back at him were alive. They were the eyes of a man who woke up each morning excited about the day ahead. They were the eyes of someone who had learned the difference between being successful and being significant. They were the eyes of a person who had discovered that the most powerful transformation you can experience is becoming who you were always meant to be. But here's what James understood now that he couldn't have understood 3 years ago. Transformation isn't an event that happens once and then you're done. Transformation is a lifestyle. It's a daily commitment to growth, to authenticity, to becoming more of who you really are rather than less. Every morning, James still looked in the mirror, but now it wasn't to confront lies or face uncomfortable truths. Now it was to acknowledge the person he had become and recommit to the person he was still becoming, because transformation never ends. It just gets more refined, more intentional, more powerful. Michael learned this same lesson. 5 years after his transformation began, Michael's nonprofit organization had grown into a network of recovery and development centers in 12 cities. But Michael's greatest achievement wasn't the size of his organization. It was the consistency of his character. Day after day, year after year, Michael continued to be the same transformed person who had emerged on day 3 of his journey. The test of real transformation isn't what you do when you're motivated. It's what you do when motivation fades, when challenges arise, when old temptations resurface. Real transformation creates a new normal that sustains itself even under pressure. Michael faced his greatest test when his father, who had been absent for most of his life, suddenly reappeared asking for money. The old Michael would have either given money he couldn't afford or responded with anger and resentment. But the transformed Michael did something different. He offered his father something more valuable than money. He offered him the same opportunity for transformation that Michael had given himself. Michael's father initially rejected the offer. He wanted a handout, not a hand up. But Michael remained consistent with his new identity. He maintained his boundaries while keeping his heart open. 6 months later, his father came back, not asking for money, but asking for help, changing his life. This is what living as a transformed person looks like. It means your values are no longer negotiable. It means your standards don't fluctuate based on circumstances. It means you respond to situations from your transformed identity rather than your old patterns. James experienced this same kind of testing when his former company offered him a position as senior vice president with a salary triple what he was making in his new business. The old James would have jumped at the security and prestige, but the transformed James understood that some opportunities are actually traps designed to pull you back into an old version of yourself. James declined the offer without a moment's hesitation, not because he didn't want financial security, but because he understood that trading your authentic life for someone else's definition of success is the most expensive mistake you can make. Living as the person you were meant to be means understanding that your life is not just about you anymore. Everything you do either adds to or subtracts from the example you're setting for others. Every choice you make either reinforces or undermines the possibility that transformation creates. When James looks in the mirror now, he doesn't just see himself. He sees Sandra, who built her successful consultancy. He sees Frank, who saved his marriage. He sees Kevin, who's now a successful filmmaker. He sees every person whose life has been touched by his decision to change his own life. That's the ultimate measure of transformation. It's not what you achieve for yourself. It's what becomes possible for others because of what you achieve for yourself. It's not the life you built. It's the lives that got built because you showed them how building was done. Michael sees the same thing when he looks at his reflection. He sees Tony, who now employs 30 people in his landscaping business. He sees Carmen, who just celebrated 5 years as a nurse and recently got promoted to supervisor. He sees Anthony, whose art now hangs in galleries across 3 states. He sees hundreds of people whose lives are different because Michael chose to make his life different. Your transformation is never just about you. It's about everyone who will be affected by the person you become. It's about the family member who will find courage in your courage. It's about the coworker who will find possibility in your example. It's about the stranger who will find hope in your story. When you fix yourself in 3 days, you don't just fix your life, you begin fixing every life you touch. And those lives go on to touch other lives. And the transformation that started with one honest look in a mirror ripples out in ways you'll never fully know, but will always be responsible for. That's the power of becoming who you were meant to be. That's the legacy of real transformation. That's why 3 days of courage can create decades of impact.